Hi, Peter Boyles, of course, every Saturday morning right down the hall at 9 in the morning, 9 until noon. I do the 710 KNUS talk show then. And also because of the kindness of Kelly and Mark and, of course, Brian, we're able to do what we have now dubbed the shoot. Coming from pro wrestling, there are works and there are shoots. And I get to actually pursue my passions in history, being able to do this and being able to read and being able to have a remarkable guy like Mark Crowley with me. But this is one of those shows. Edward Epstein is with us. He's in New York. The book is Frank and Marilyn. I've been talking about this book on the radio show. He's kind enough to join us on the shoot, and he's also going to join us on the radio show. I make this case with people. I go get the book. It's how much I want to read it. Edward, congratulations. It's an absolutely wonderful read, and welcome to the shoot, and thanks for doing the show.
Thank you very, very much. And it's my pleasure to do the show.
Yeah, we were talking, we get to talk before it begins, and I have this sort of supposition, and this is my young manhood, childhood, through the Kennedys and through all of this, and I'm drawn to it, and you're an incredible historian on it, and I kind of come to this conclusion. Well, Jack Kennedy gets killed by one single gunman in Dallas, Texas. Marilyn Monroe simply overdoses. The CIA goes away. John Rosselli gets murdered. Sam Giancana gets murdered. Never mind, we're going to go to war in Vietnam. And as though it's just all over, and Sinatra ends up, of course, putting Ronald Reagan over at his inaugural. So there's a question in there somewhere, and it's all yours. Your thoughts?
Okay, your listeners, and you may find this interesting. You know, the Kennedys were Hollywood oriented from the very beginning. It's not like Marilyn had an affair with Dwight Eisenhower or Harry Truman. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, was one of the major power brokers in the early days of Hollywood. He was instrumental in founding RKO Studios, one of the big studios. He was totally connected with what was once known as the underworld from the 1920s. So that when, it'll be interesting to start with this perhaps, because the book is Frank and Marilyn, and it's about their relationship. But as far as Marilyn's relationship with John Kennedy, when she had thought she might marry him, and people said, oh, she's crazy. How could she think that? Well, Marilyn had married the world's most famous and respected baseball player. She then married, not just lived with, the world's most respected playwright, Arthur Miller. She became a darling of the New York intelligentsia. Truman Capote wanted her to play Holly Golightly in Breakfast at Tiffany's, the role, of course, that went to Audrey Hepburn. Marilyn was a player, so that when she was in the midst of getting a divorce from Arthur Miller, she wasn't happy with the picture she was making at the time, which was Let's Make Love. She needed something big, something important, so she could keep the momentum going of who she was. And that person was Jack Kennedy. Now, Kennedy had romances with big Hollywood stars. Your listeners may be familiar with a classic film called Laura. The star was a gorgeous brunette, Jean Tierney, who was crazy about him. And they had a big, deep affair, and she expected that to lead to marriage. He wasn't married yet. But because she was a divorced woman, he couldn't marry her. That was his excuse. But in other words, Kennedy was seeped in Hollywood, the Hollywood lifestyle. He was not like other politicians when it came to that. So then when Marilyn thought she might have a chance at marrying him, for people in the know, this was, for her, from her perspective, this was a possibility. She'd married DiMaggio, she'd married Arthur Miller, and next could be Jack Kennedy.
The one difference is that Jack's married. He's married to Jacqueline Bouvier, And I think Joe,
Marilyn described as a statue.
yeah, oh, there's a number of wonderful books about her. She was an ACA. I'm alcoholic and in recovery, and we talk about adult children of alcoholics, ACA. Jackie Kennedy, if you looked up ACA in the encyclopedia, her picture would be there. Blackjack Bouvier and her mother and Uncle Udi, and these people are playing out, like, this is what I love about your work, they're playing out a whole separate other game that leads her to be her to marry Jack. And I mean, I'm just drawn to this.
It's fascinating, actually. Yeah. You have to keep in mind, Peter, if all this wasn't going on, we would not be talking about any of them.
No, exactly. My former wife would say, get down on your hands and knees. Thank God for these people. They give you shows. But it is true. Here's a better question. Why are you and me so drawn to this period and these people?
Well, they were icons. They became something larger than life. Yeah. And what's interesting to note, they were under 100% of the time anxiety and pressure. We see them on the red carpet. We see them attending premieres. They look wonderful. They look so happy. She's gorgeous. She's dressed beautifully, etc. But the pressure is unending on them to live up to what the public expects them to be. With Sinatra, it was his singing. Yeah. He was expected to be breathtaking at every performance. Yeah. And he did do his best. He was a devoted professional when it came to his career. But having to live up to that is a little different than living your life perpetually on the red carpet, which is what the public usually believes is happening. And with Marilyn, she wanted to be a great actress. She wasn't satisfied with the public adulation because of her looks and the fact that she'd done the nude calendar. You know, Frank and Marilyn also had in common. They had a lot in common, Peter, which people don't really recognize.
Yeah, they're both, you know, the starts they've had in life, particularly Monroe, but I mean, what a hard scrabble, hard beginning of a life as a child. Talk to that if you would, please.
Oh, well, in Frank, he was the only child and he was adored by his mother. So Frank had a firm base to embark from. Unlike Marilyn, who her mother had mental problems, was eventually institutionalized. She was in foster homes, and she did the best she could in terms of forming relationships. She always kept in touch with the people that had been kind to her when she was a member of their family, etc. And but Frank wanted to rescue her because he recognized she did not have a firm base. Frank did. What's also interesting, Peter, is Frank's first wife, the mother of his kids, who he divorced, she was a remarkable woman. Now, any other wife in that position would have those kids hate their father because of the womanizing and everything else. But she saw to it that they remained part of Frank's life. So Frank always had a base. He could always come home when some disaster, they would take him home. He was very lucky that way. Marilyn had nothing like that going. And Frank recognized that. And that's why there was a connection there. They also survived scandals. You know, not every star had to live through the number of scandals each of them had to endure. And surprisingly, they both had suicidal thoughts. Frank tried to kill himself on occasion. So he knew where she was coming from when it came to that. So there was a real connection there.
There's this moment particularly with Frank Sinatra, and I Enter the Dragon, when organized crime becomes part of his life. And there are people that talk about Dolly Sinatra being an abortionist, and she's who she is, and she understands politics and Hoboken, and that's kind of mobbed up.
You know what? I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
I find it interesting that I saw a similarity between Dolly Sinatra and Joseph Kennedy.
Absolutely.
They were both very
Absolutely.
lovely. They both expected a great deal from their kids.
Yeah.
And I think Frank recognized a little bit of his mom, Dolly, in Joe Kennedy, because Joe Kennedy and Frank Sinatra got along
Really
perfectly.
well. Can I pause you and ask a story? I've read numerous accounts that Joe needs a favor from the crime syndicates to have Jack win the West Virginia primary and went on from there. That the go-between was Frank Sinatra. It wasn't Joe talking directly to Frank Costello or anyone else. He went to Sinatra.
In,
Does that story hold up?
that story seems to be exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Sinatra did talk to Giancana about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
You know, they all such game players, because there would be occasions when Bobby Kennedy was relentlessly pursuing
Yes.
what was then called the mafia.
Yeah.
Giancana asked Frank to speak to him,
Yeah.
and Frank said he would,
Yeah.
but he didn't.
No.
He spoke to Peter Lawford, who was married to one of Kennedy's children.
Pat Lawford. Yeah.
Um, and when Lawford tried to speak to Bobby Kennedy's response was, and this is a direct quote, "Mind your own business."
Yes. But, the moment comes, and I think about it, Joe has this massive stroke.
Oh,
And it's just, and there's a takeoff moment because
that,
now
that changed everything.
everything.
Also, because Joe might have been able to control much better what was going on with Bobby and the mafia and with Frank and Marilyn and Jack. But when Joe had his stroke, a major player was removed from the chessboard.
Yeah, yeah.
Things started to get out of control.
Is it Bobby? I mean, Jack. There's the time that comes where Sinatra thinks he's going to host Jack Kennedy at his home, and he builds the helicopter pad, and he does all of this, and then it's Hoover. I'm finishing because it's lengthy, and I'm reading you and everybody else. G-Man, that new book that's out from the woman historian Gage on Hoover. Hoover knows about this relationship between Judith Campbell and everything that's going on. Are they passing secrets? And so Bobby says, you got to go, and he ends up to go to Bing Crosby's house. Tell that story.
Well, things were unraveling fast.
Yeah.
The last year of Marilyn's life. What's also interesting, just to backtrack a little, is that Sinatra asked Marilyn to marry him.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Yeah.
And Joe DiMaggio wanted her to remarry him. And the fact of the matter is, neither man was a picnic. They both had their major problems, and Marilyn was no picnic. And the reason that Marilyn turned Frank down is because I think she instinctively realized, with all of her problems and that she had just was coming off a nervous breakdown, that Frank was the kind of person. Don't forget, Frank and Marilyn had the same psychiatrist at the point, in addition to the same powerful lawyer. They were that connected. But Frank was somebody who, when there was some kind of problem, he was going to take care of it. If Marilyn were going to have mental problems, she'd be in a hospital in 5 seconds if she was Mrs. Sinatra. Mm-hmm. So that terrified her. So that's what she might face if she would have married Sinatra. And with DiMaggio, he wanted her to turn her back on her career, which was as important as breathing to her. Yeah. So the choice between Frank Sinatra and Joe DiMaggio isn't 3 people on the red carpet, like, there's Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, and aren't they happy, etc. Neither man was a picnic as far as she was concerned, and vice versa, but she had chosen Joe because he would never have institutionalized her.
No. How at one time, and by the way, I've talked about you many times on the radio show. I
Thank
never,
you.
no, no, please. I never knew that Joe D turned Sinatra away at the door of the funeral. That was new stuff to me. And if talk to that for a moment.
Well, the reason that Frank and Marilyn's longtime friendship and occasional intimate friendship
Yeah, yeah,
was always kept out of the public eye. That was intentional. Was the reason was Joe DiMaggio.
yeah.
I mean, he was the third party. It was Joe, Frank, and Marilyn. Joe and Frank had been best buddies before Frank ever met Marilyn. And Marilyn was scheduled to make a movie with Frank. It was called Pink Tights, of which Joe did his best to make sure didn't happen, and it didn't happen. But it didn't happen not mainly because of Joe. It's because she wanted to be an actress, a respected actress. And the Pink Tights movie was like a Betty Grable movie. It was nothing. So she turned her back on it with Joe's encouragement. And then she married Joe. And she hadn't even met Frank. I think your listeners will find this interesting because she didn't meet Frank on the red carpet or at a party. Frank and Joe had dinner one evening because Joe suspected Marilyn was having an affair, which she was, and wanted to catch her in the act because that would make her divorcing him less likely, because that kind of scandal would kill her career. So here were Joe and Frank having dinner. I named the restaurant, etc. And Frank had recommended a private detective to get the goods on Marilyn. And this was the same private detective that Frank had hired to get the goods on Ava Gardner. So Joe and Frank are having dinner. A call comes for Joe from the private detective. He's outside the apartment where Marilyn is having her assignation with her current lover. Does Joe want to come over as the private detective? And a photographer catches her in the act. Of course, Joe is on his way. He asks Frank, do you want to go? Frank isn't sure he wants it, but he goes. Okay. So there's Joe DiMaggio, Frank Sinatra drive over to this apartment building in this quiet neighborhood. It would be called a condo today, like a 3-story condo. And Marilyn is upstairs with her boyfriend. And she senses something is in the works and goes to the window, and there she sees DiMaggio and Sinatra. It's only 2 stories below. And P.S., the building manager is looking from another window. I'm leading up to how they met, how Frank and Marilyn met. So the photographer, Joe and Frank, go upstairs to break into the apartment. They break into the wrong apartment. And this is not publicized. This is swept under the rug. Can you imagine today? People would have their iPhones. You'd know about it within 2 hours. Then the studios kept it completely quiet. Marilyn and Hal, that was her current boyfriend, escaped out the back door. Marilyn subsequently said she thought she was grateful to Frank because she thought Frank had intentionally led them to the wrong apartment. Marilyn was a romantic. You know, people don't realize that. So that was known subsequently, eventually, when it became public the next year, as the wrong door raid. So she was totally emotionally drained from the whole DiMaggio experience. She was a battered woman. He had beaten her.
He had hit her. Yeah, read that.
The 7-Year Itch, where the skirt blew up, and that was filmed in New York, and he was there. And when she got back to the hotel, she was finished with Joe as a husband, not as a friend, but as a husband. Frank had tried to slit his wrists when Ava walked out on him. So he was emotionally a mess. As he would tell his friend, the singer Dinah Shore, my private life is S blank blank T. Okay. They were both drained. That's when they got together. Um, so, in other words, they had a lot in common, Peter, which carried them through the next 4 or 5 years as they each experimented in other directions. Frank always had other women in his life, and she had other men in her life, but they were never famous. I mean, they weren't limited to their own type. You didn't have to be a love goddess or a singing icon to intrigue them. They would be intrigued. She would have been intrigued by you.
Mm. Well, Joe,
I mean, not, why not?
No, when Joe turns him away and he says those Irish, well, I think it's Dean Martin says, he calls them those Irish gangsters, calls the Kennedys that, and he won't go campaign for Jack.
Dean Martin never trusted Jack Kennedy.
Yes.
He had been intimate in that whole group.
Yeah.
And he warned Frank. He told Frank that guy is going to be trouble for you.
Yep.
I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he told him. And
no,
he stayed away from him.
It's interesting. Dean Martin, out of all of this time period you and I are discussing that I'm enamored to, Dean Martin shines. He won't complete the movie without Monroe. He won't have anything to do with the Kennedys. And part of it, I've also read this, that Joe Kennedy did not want Sammy Davis out campaigning.
Absolutely. He didn't want him at the inauguration either.
Indeed, because he was married to a white woman.
At the inauguration, which was a huge problem for Frank, who literally considered Sammy Davis his brother. He was an only child.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Did consider him a brother. And when Sammy eventually died 35 years later, that devastated him more than when people closer to him passed away.
But
no, Sammy was kept out of the inauguration.
Yeah. But again, when organized crime, sort of that Bruce Lee, Enter the Dragon, and it's clear to most people like I respect, like yourself, organized crime helps Jack Kennedy.
Yes.
Joe DiMaggio is Joe D. I mean, there's nobody like Joe D. Monroe.
Joe was connected to the mafia too.
Yes. And tell that story, how Joe's connected too.
One of the reasons Joe was they went out of their way to keep their relationship out of the press. Joe and Frank had some of the same friends who were top tier in the mafia.
Yeah.
And both Joe and Frank were very valuable assets.
Yes.
Joe, in public relations terms, when he would show up at certain events, he lent a certain dignity, a certain respect as this great sports icon. He was friendly with some of the major people, and one of the major ones actually brought a valise full of cash to DiMaggio at one point to hold for him, which DiMaggio did.
Yeah.
Never opened it, and when he was ready to retrieve the cash, he did. So Sinatra and DiMaggio, with men like that, there were certain women in their lives that were off base to the others. You didn't make a play for Ava. Can you imagine? Here, let me give you a scenario that, to my great surprise, no one has ever come up with, but I'll give it to you now. Can you imagine if DiMaggio had begun an affair with Ava Gardner?
Oh.
That would have, well, think about it. That would have been World War III. Well, that's what Frank did by starting up with Marilyn, because Marilyn was the Ava Gardner in Joe DiMaggio's life.
But when the moment comes at the funeral, which again, that's your research, and Joe D turns him away at the door, was it because of his introduction to he introduces Marilyn to the Kennedys? Or was that some other reasons?
So I don't think there's any doubt about it. DiMaggio spoke about that in his later years. He said that the Kennedys have been getting away with stuff since the beginning of time, and they'll always get away with stuff. And Marilyn sensed that something very dangerous could be in the works. And she told that to Joe. Absolutely. Yeah, that was a big problem. As I'm going to go back to the one of Joe Kennedy's lifelong friends, there's pictures of him late in life, of Joseph Skank visiting the Palm Beach. Joe Skank was as big an operator as Sam Giancana in the movie business. And Joseph Skank, by the way, was one of Marilyn's mentors.
So what's Joe's anger truly about when he won't let Sinatra in?
Oh, in my opinion, it's totally because Sinatra had started up with Marilyn and got her involved with the Kennedys.
Yeah.
Didn't forgive him for that. And that was that. And kept him out of the funeral. I'm not sure that he personally did that. I'm sure that his people, quote, close quote, at the door, him out, and Frank showed up with his people, quote, quote, and they were turned away.
Turned away.
Absolutely because of Marilyn. 100%, in my view.
Was she killed? Do you believe she was killed?
Joe did. DiMaggio eventually.
Oh, absolutely did. Yeah.
Don't forget, there was so much going on. With the mafia, and also the mafia had great respect for DiMaggio because he wasn't a showbiz guy. He had made his mark as a great sports figure, which everybody respected, et cetera, et cetera. You have to wonder. I mean, we're in the realm of speculation here. But
I believe it. Yeah.
Did the mafia, were they going to harm Marilyn, knowing
that
DiMaggio had these feelings for her because they respected him, and knowing that Frank is Frank fortunate that he never called Marilyn on the day of her death. Otherwise, he would have been entangled in that mess big time forever. But he was one of the people who called her at the end. I'm not letting you talk, Peter. I'm sorry.
No. I know. I think it was your book when the people that bought Monroe's house and they had to put a roof on it. Was it your research? They found all the wiretaps.
Yes,
that was your work.
Yeah, it was the actress Veronica Hamill, I think that was her name, and her husband who bought the Monroe estate. And a lot of work had to be done, and the contractors discovered, absolutely it was wine. Sure, for sure. They were. She was, as I said, she was a player. Yeah. She wasn't this, this blonde
goddess.
She was intelligent.
Oh.
I'll give you, which your listeners may or may not be familiar with. When she married Miller, she was not a religious person, but she converted to Judaism.
She did, yeah.
He came from a very educated family. She stayed friendly with his father, who was her escort to the Happy Birthday, Mr. President event. Isidore Miller, Arthur Miller, was her escort to that event. This is my point. Okay. She converted to Judaism. She took the lessons, et cetera, et cetera. Flash forward, she's making Something's Got to Give, a disaster from the beginning. Her last movie. Okay. She's taking her dolls, like Jacqueline Suzanne invented the term dolls, Valley of the Dolls. She's on her medication, blah, blah. She's always late. The day she doesn't show up. One day, the Shah and Empress of Iran show up on the set. And the producer of the movie calls her and begs her to come to the set and be photographed with the Shah and Empress of Iran. That's publicity for the movie, publicity for her. So here she is in this terrible strait, and she says, no. Why won't she show up? Because of their attitude towards Israel.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah.
So she wasn't out of it to the extent where she wasn't thinking clearly. She had gotten her lessons with the Arthur Miller family. So there you go. So you weren't dealing with a dummy here.
I agree. I mean, I think, but come back full circle. It's like when you read the organized crime books that go on, and when someone is murdered or whacked or hit, the families would sit down and ask, who profits? And that was probably the assassin. And so when Monroe, and I believe that she was killed.
Let me offer this.
All right.
Let me put this in the arena.
All right.
Marilyn was a genius at public relations. Unlike Frank, who didn't get along with many important members of the press, he needed PR people. Marilyn made friends with certain newspaper people from the beginning. The press was instrumental in her rise to fame. Sidney Skolsky, the famous columnist, etc. So when Marilyn announced finally she was thinking of having a press conference announcing her relationship with the two Kennedy brothers, and this was not some Hollywood chorus person who would have she knew how to organize a press conference. She knew who would be there. If she was going to have a press conference to announce this incredible revelation, these were the reporters to reckon with. So when you say who had the most to lose,
the Kennedys.
It would seem that way.
Yeah, no, and they had willing participants in Jack's Irish Mafia. We know that Hoover was clearly
odds on everybody.
Oh, and disliked Bobby Kennedy immensely.
Yep.
The organized crime guys, well, she was an asset. She wasn't an enemy. Joe D, no. Frank, no. It was Bobby Kennedy, and I don't know, the Jack part of this, but I firmly believe, and I believe Bobby Kennedy was there, and I firmly believe that he was certainly capable of eliminating anything.
This was talked about not long afterwards. Like Victor Lasky, who was a great journalist.
Absolutely. I have his book. There
were people around at the time who made the red flags and the bells clanging. Fill up Radio City Music Hall of all the stuff that was going wrong, how poorly things were handled. It seems there's confirmation that Robert Kennedy was in town. I personally, I feel sorry for his family because, sins of the father, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can't help who your parents are. And you can't write the kids off just because they had, but their parents were players. They were a dangerous group.
I have this theory. I love having you with me, and you're going to do the radio with us coming up. And I'm not a religious person, so Joe Kennedy made a deal with the devil, and he double-crossed the devil. And the devil said, I'll get every one of you. And every generation since Joe Kennedy, the ambassador, he's done things to their family up until, John going down in the airplane, and they're finding Bobby's kids. And it was like he double-crossed the devil. Somehow it all gets back to the ambassador, his relationships with Frank Costello. And these guys, I love what you're saying, Edward, because you're spot on. They're who they are.
Even in his lifetime, I mean, for a person like Joe Kennedy to suffer a debilitating stroke, Peter, I mean, and he couldn't speak properly. I mean, so in other words, it's not like he left the game and he was lucky.
No.
He was here and had to see everything that went on. What kind of torture was that? The
devil.
Try to get across is how the people I'm writing about felt.
Oh.
Rather than taking a godlike view of this happened and that happened. Yeah. How could they have been so stupid? Well, they were, and they had to pay for it.
He's in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets on the porch at Hyannisport, and does he know that Jack's dead?
I'm sure he did.
I do too. Did he know that he could have stopped Bobby because, the Hoffa Wars and going after Sam Giancana and going after Carlos Marcello there's a book by the Giancanas called Double Cross, And they make the case. They go, hey, we made him. We paid for him. We took care of him in West Virginia, Chicago. We funded the money, and he double-crossed us. And it was Bobby, but killing Bobby meant nothing. You got to kill Jack. And I think that the Kennedys got rid of Marilyn Monroe. This is all my supposition. And then we hit this point where we started, and then it's all never mind. Jack's dead. Marilyn's dead. The war in Vietnam now is underway. Civil rights struggle begins in this country, and everything is.
Marilyn's death was once described as the first assassination of the 60s.
Yes, I believe it. I believe if you understood Malcolm X's murder, if you understood Jack Kennedy, if you understand Cuba, if you understand these things,
Marilyn would have been very unhappy in the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, taking a godlike view of it, because that's what I'm doing. But I don't think she was. I don't think she was set for the 60s.
No, you know, and you wonder, would there have been young kids around the White House going, hey, JFK, how many kids did you kill today? And what would have happened to all of it? And instead, it goes. What I am, and you're going to do the radio show with us. This is a remarkable man, Edward Epstein.
Well,
you gave me. I didn't put the book down. That's how much let me hold it up to the camera. There it is, so people can see it. But I'm at this point where, you know, epochs of history or plates of the earth shifting. Jack's dead. I'm a kid working. She dies first. He's dead. Then Bobby gets killed. And then of course the deaths in the mafia, where these guys are going to go before the church committee, and they kill Johnny Rosselli and they kill Sam Giancana. And then it's like, well, never mind. We have a war, and then we have, and so I brought the show together on this premise. I give you that to address. It just all stopped, and no one. And you're right. There was you know, Mark Lane, and there was Victor. There's all these guys that were saying, look over here, look over here.
And that was close to the event.
Yeah.
It's not looking at things 50 years later.
No.
They were examining things close to the time it happened. You know, that when you're in court, if it's a murder case and the defense has a witness that remembers something that happened 30 years ago, you know, the prosecution will always say, well, that's 30 years ago.
Yeah.
You'd be mistaken, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But everything fell apart with the Kennedy assassination.
I agree. It was over.
Johnson's presidency, they didn't do him any good either.
No. It was almost like it was cursed.
Yes.
And on all of these people. I didn't get a chance to talk about Mia Farrow. I didn't get a chance to talk about Ava Gardner. You're going to do the radio show with us, I think, this coming weekend. What are you working on now? I mean, I don't want you to tip your hat, but what are you looking at now?
Well, I'm examining the possibilities. I haven't decided. You know, my previous book was another under-the-radar relationship of two icons, Audrey Hepburn and William Holden. The book was Audrey and Bill.
Man.
So when you've written about Audrey and Frank and Marilyn, and previously I did a biography of Mia Farrow. I did Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward.
Favorites.
There aren't too many on that level left to write about, Peter.
Can I sidebar you with a final question that has nothing to do with what we've talked about?
Sure.
The Woody Allen, Mia Farrow, where are you with that? In terms of, did Woody do that or did he not?
Well,
I'm sorry.
All right. Well, what I'm going to say about Mia, it'll be interesting. We can pick it up, I guess.
Also married to Sinatra too. So yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
He married Mia just 3 or 4 years after Marilyn's death.
Yeah.
I worked with Mia. I was media contact for MCA Universal Pictures in New York.
Wow.
She had a movie with Elizabeth Taylor called Secret Ceremony.
Yeah.
She came into New York to publicize the film. And Mia was gorgeous. I mean, people say, well, how could he have gone from Ava Gardner and Marilyn Monroe to Mia Farrow? Well, if you saw her, she was beautiful. She wasn't a sex goddess beautiful.
No. But what did Ava Gardner say? Eventually he'd end up marrying a boy, and it was Mia Farrow.
He said to Rex Reed,
yeah.
But there was nothing.
Oh, it was Rex Reed? Okay.
There was nothing boyish about Ava. She was an Audrey Hepburn type.
Yeah.
She had a beautiful face. She had a beautiful voice.
Oh.
She had a very otherworldly aura about it. So I could see why he would have
I
been
loved her.
interested.
Yeah. Well, help me now, because the charge was always on Woody being a pedophile.
Well, I think Woody was a bad boy.
Was he? Okay. All right. That ends it. Yeah. And I love Woody. I mean, Radio Days is like one of my, if it's on, I watch it. And
Woody is brilliant.
Oh, I will see you this weekend. You're a gift. I'll be calling on you many times and add you to the Rolodex. And you're a wonderful, wonderful guest, Edward. And this has really been a tremendous shoot for me.
You know, Peter, and I mean this too, you're a great host.
And at moments like this, I always say, jockeys are only as good as their horses. And you're a great horse.
Okay.
I'll see you,
I've never
Edward. I'll see you this week. Thanks, man. Thank you very much. To Mark Crowley and everybody else, thank you. This has been remarkable. In a series, we did Mafia Spies last week, and they just tie right into this. You take care of yourself. See you Saturday, and Edward will be with us this weekend. See you guys.